So I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker. It's Mark Goldring. Mark has a wealth of experience leading international organisations like Oxfam, as well as national and local voluntary and community organisations. And he's the former director of Asylum Welcome here in Oxford. And thank you, Mark, for stepping in as our speaker today on an extremely important topic, one in which needs a serious rebalancing in public debate, and that's immigration, or as I used to think of it when I was at college, forced migration. And how, despite the misconceptions and scapegoating that we hear day in and day out, we have all benefited and are benefiting from migration and immigration, both in an economic sense and a social and cultural sense. So I'll hand over to Mark, who will now take us through some of the myths about migration and also the necessity of replacing resentment with compassion. Thank you, Mark.
Good. Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to join you, partly because I think the topic is so important, but partly also because I've seen, and in my village, we've benefited from the work of CFO in the last year, and I can see the real value of supporting community action across the county. So Emily introduced me with the topic of migration. So let's start there, because this week, I visited my mum in her care home. Half the staff there were born, grew up, trained in India. I went to a lecture at the university last night. The lecturer was Albanian, and in the dinner afterwards, I sat between an Argentinian and a Chinese student. I visited my brother, whose carer is a Mauritian nurse, and we had our cleaner come round once a fortnight, and she is Polish. It's a reminder that 1 in 6 of the population of Oxfordshire were not born here in the UK. 1 in 3 in the city is that true for, partly because, of course, we've got the 2 universities and we've got the big hospitals with real concentrations of international staff. At Oxford University alone, 12,000 international students, but 9,000 of those coming from outside the European Union. And the biggest nationalities would include Polish, Indian, Romanian, but there's an amazingly diverse mixture. Perhaps the biggest hidden group come in national stats under the title of Portuguese, but actually they're East Timorese, and they've come to Britain through a first colonial and an EU link, and they're perhaps the biggest hidden minority in the county, with 3,000 or 4,000 East Timorese living among us, usually not visible to the rest of the population and sharing many of the characteristics of refugees, even though they are actually not refugees themselves. Within this group of migrants, some will stay, some will leave, some don't know what they're going to do now and make up their mind as they go along. But I'm now going to concentrate on the group within them who we call and think of as refugees and asylum seekers. That's maybe 7 to 10% of this 100,000 migrants in the county. So about 1% of the population of the county. Let me bring that alive with 2 recent experiences. One was a former client of Asylum Welcome, an Afghan who came across having been evacuated when Kabul fell in 2021. And he phoned me up and he asked if he could meet. So I assumed he wanted help with a job, a house, a reference, something on the next stage. But he didn't. He wanted to tell me about the bed and breakfast that he'd set up on the Cowley Road and which was thriving, and if he could make rooms available to refugees or asylum seekers on a short-term basis. He had to cover his costs, but he was very keen to do so. It was a success story of integration, as he told me about his wife now at Brooks and his children thriving in school. The other was meeting a member of Asylum Welcome staff earlier this week who told me about the tents that had gone up outside the Kassam Hotel in Oxford, one of the asylum hotels, where there were half a dozen men camping because they'd been evicted from the hotel for reasons that I'll come to later, and whose tents had been burnt down a couple of days previously by vigilantes who attacked them during the night, damaged their property, destroyed their tents, and chased them off. So they were literally sleeping in the woods behind Blackbird Leys. Two very different experiences, both very true of Oxfordshire. Now, there's no accurate figure for the number of refugees in our county because refugees don't fly a flag. Once you've assimilated, once you've been given your status, you move on. You are just a resident with a long-term right to remain, progressing to indefinite right to remain, and maybe citizenship in due course. So you don't promote it. You're not categorized in any particular way. So actual numbers are hard to come by. But my guess is that in our county, between 8 and 10,000 people have come to Oxfordshire as refugees in one form or another, probably similar in number to that number of non-EU international students at the university. And by refugees, we're talking here about people who either fit the international definition of a reasonable fear of persecution, or where the UK has decided to widen that definition for humanitarian reasons, as it's done with a number of very specific schemes. Now, that's a huge change in Oxfordshire in the last 5 years, beginning with 2021, the Afghans coming, 2022, 23 Ukrainians, a range of other groups also coming, and then the asylum hotels being set up in 2023 around the county. But who are the biggest group of refugees in Oxfordshire? I would pose that as a question, but you're mostly muted. So the answer is actually none of the groups that I've mentioned. The biggest group of people who have been given humanitarian protection in Oxfordshire are from Hong Kong. And they've come through a route that was created by the government a couple of years ago to allow Hong Kong residents who have British nationality to settle in UK. There are up to 200,000 such people in the UK and more than 3,000 of them in Oxfordshire. Now, many of them are thriving. They've settled here. They've found work. They've started businesses. So they're not what we necessarily think about as refugees. But in terms of the challenges for our housing, our education services, our health services, integration of communities, that is quite a significant number of new arrivals in the last 2 to 3 years. After that, we have Ukrainians. About 2,500 came, hosted in Oxfordshire. Many are still here, probably more than 1,500. Mostly now have got their own houses, but more than 400 are still living with local families, as a real sign of Oxfordshire, as indeed the rest of the country did, reaching out and welcoming new arrivals. Then we have those who came from Afghanistan, evacuated mostly in 21-22 when the Taliban took over. But because of our military links, both with Brize Norton and with Shrivenham, some are still arriving today and being settled on those official programs. And indeed, there's a small number of other refugees, but I'm talking in the tens, who've come on other official resettlement programs. Because one of the big features of being a refugee, of wanting to come to the UK as a refugee, is that with the exception of the 3 countries I've just talked about, there is no way of actually making that happen without getting to the UK. You've got to get here first, which of course answers part of the question about why the small boats. There's no way of applying for asylum outside the UK, with the exception of literally a few dozen people a year. Then you've got those people who came as asylum seekers and have settled long-term in Oxfordshire, a few hundred. And then you have perhaps what much public focus is on at the moment, which is 600 asylum seekers in 3 hotels around Oxfordshire, Banbury, Witney, and the Kassam in Oxford. 2 hotels for families, 1 for single men. And those are people who are generally arriving. About a third of them come by small boats, but it's a myth that all asylum seekers are coming to the UK by small boats. The figure's about a third. And they are then sent by the authorities around the country, and about 600 are here in Oxfordshire. And we'll come back to those in a minute, because I just want to touch on 2 other groups. One is those who work in social services will know that we've probably got about 200 unaccompanied asylum seeking children who either are still juveniles or have recently turned 18, between 18 and 21, still getting support from social services. And they're a group of people who find it really hard to make their way in society when they do graduate from council or foster care, because they're struggling in a new society where they haven't got long-term legal status. And then the last group I want to touch on are those who have not yet come, but anytime from December onwards, it is likely that the Home Office will reopen Campsfield Immigration Detention Centre, just north of Oxford. And that will have initially up to 200 men who are awaiting deportation. As many of you will know, that Campsfield was open and closed in 2017. It's now being reopened again on our doorstep. Now, the terms and conditions, the way of life of those groups are massively different. Ukrainians were welcomed into people's houses. The Afghans who came in the early days were put up in hotels and given intensive support. They had the right to work from the moment they got here. They had the full privileges of a long-term resident. And I want to concentrate now on those who find it more difficult, who are the asylum seekers and the refugees who newly get status. So what happens? People arrive in the UK by many different means. About a third on small boats, some still by lorry, others will come on tourist visas or student visas, or to see family members. They'll claim asylum. They'll be, in many cases, sent to one of the 3 hotels in Oxfordshire. There are many different nationalities, and we can't know all their stories. Having worked with them for 5 years, I saw many who had escaped desperate suffering. I saw a few who were clearly just trying in an opportunist way for somewhere else to live. And I saw many more in between who were desperately struggling and suffering in their own country. The question is, did that suffering meet an international definition of persecution? Or was it simply, as in Sudan today, the fact that you've got a terrible civil war going on, which destroys your life, members of your family, and you don't know if you're going to be next? Of the people who claim asylum, about 50% are granted it initially, and about 70% in total after appeal. And that's by the Home Office or by the courts, suggesting that a high proportion of people who do come are actually fleeing something that UK recognises as being persecution. And while they're here claiming asylum, if they're in the hotel, they'll get £9 something a week to live on and 3 meals. if they're living in community accommodation, they'll get just under £50 a week to live on, but they are not entitled to any other benefits. More significantly, they're not entitled to work. And this is really holding people back, because it means that you've got bored, lonely, worried people living in a hotel where they've got no control of their own life, where hotel is, of course, the name of the building, but it certainly doesn't feel like it. If you are a Eritrean Muslim speaking only your own language, and you're put in a room with a Romanian Christian who has completely different language and habits to you, and you get institutionalized meals if you turn up on time, and you're not allowed to work, and the education you can enroll in is very limited, it certainly doesn't feel like a hotel. So the work of community organizations, with everything from bus passes to allow people to travel into the town from the hotel, the work of food banks, the work of sports clubs who've reached out, is amazingly valuable and important. When people get their this whole system is run by the Home Office and contracted out to potentially, well, not potentially, massively profit-making private companies, three who run the whole estate across the country and are making hundreds of millions a year in profit from it. But once the decision is made, if somebody gets their status and is adjudicated to be allowed to stay, they effectively become much more the responsibility of councils. So councils have very little control of the system. They offer support. But once that person gets a decision, the Home Office rule, which shortened the time period earlier this year, is that those residents have to leave the hotels in 28 days. Now, given that they won't even get their universal credit in that time, that they've got to find somewhere to live. They haven't got references in England. Many of them haven't got a bank account. It's amazingly difficult. And I'd say the biggest challenge for local organisations and for community well-being and for councils at the moment, in terms of refugees in Oxfordshire and indeed every other county, is this sense of what happens next. Because if you're entitled to the lowest rate of housing benefit, you're a single man, you're not a council responsibility to house, you've got 28 days to find somewhere that you can pay to live in, you will be sitting in the reception of Asylum Welcome and like-minded agencies saying, help, help, help. And what they can do is very limited. Obviously, this is aggravated by the fact that most people are not allowed to work ahead of this time. And therefore, they've done little in the way of preparation, in spite of the best efforts of charities, councils, education institutions to offer opportunities. Now, one way of looking at this is that we're actually making real progress, because a year ago people were absolutely stuck in hotels and the then government was not processing their asylum claims, so the backlog was getting longer and longer. Now the government sorry, someone trying to come in. No. Now the government very positively is trying to respond, but that's creating the real challenge of what happens as everybody gets their asylum claim and now finds themselves quite literally camping outside the hotel at terrible risk. So what can we do about it? I think the biggest thing is every community organisation looking at its own work and thinking, are we thinking inclusively about how refugees, how asylum seekers can benefit from this? Is there something we can do which is within our own sphere? Housing is the obvious one, but education, social groups, the cricket team reaching reaching out, the youth club reaching out, groups like that can make a vast difference. And we're lucky in Oxfordshire that we have some go-ahead councils who've really tried to join up as councils of sanctuary, which is a sense of we will make a plan, we will make a commitment. Oxfordshire have done it, City have done it, West are doing it, others are looking at what they can do. So people running community organisations, liaising both with organisations like Asylum Welcome and Refugee Resource, but also looking at how can we link with the council and see what they're doing and how we could complement this in a way that's relevant to our own work is, to me, the most valuable issue. The other is just to recognise as you come across people who might be recent arrivals, just how vulnerable they are. As I said, refugees don't fly a flag. But I visited Carterton 2 weeks ago, and right next to the house of a new refugee was a house with a Union Jack or a cross of St. George hanging outside it. Now, it doesn't mean those individuals were hostile, but it's quite a threat and quite a risk in the current climate and environment. So, to me, the biggest challenge is for us as community organisations, as councils, looking at what do we do? Have we thought about how refugees can be included in this? Can we go the extra mile? And that will make a vast difference to that sense of people being included and of well-being. And quite often, those are things that can be jointly planned. Funding is not great. Home Office obviously desperately trying to cut their costs, which means they're giving less to councils for these purposes, but there are some funds, and it doesn't mean therefore an organisation has to start by saying we have to do this, we have to pay for all of this. Oxfordshire generally, compared with many parts of the world, has been amazingly supportive in the arrival of refugees, both at official levels, the dentists, the doctors, the medical practice, the schools that have gone the extra mile are legion. But there is a real danger that in this current increasingly hostile environment, that the spread of myth, the fear of the unknown, that ability to say we can't get an appointment at our local GP, it must be refugees' fault. Let's remember refugees are less than 1% of our county population. All of those things are areas where, as good citizens, I think there is more that we can do to make Oxfordshire a positive place for refugees to arrive and to live in. And that's the point that I'll stop. I'll certainly open up to anything people would like to hear about. I've skimmed over many areas, and there'll be some things that I'm sure you want to know more about, or indeed offer views on.
Thank you, Mark. And please do put your hand up. Your electronic hand will be probably best because you'll then put into a line if you've got questions for Mark. Mark, my main takeaway is that we have such a disabling system in place. And I think we're being kind when we say myths. We've been told lies quite a lot. So yes, and I love the fact you've just ended on actually what we could do almost on an everyday basis, which would just help some of this and help perhaps enable some of these systems that are clearly disabling. Okay, has anyone got a question for Mark? Oh, Stephen, you've got your actual hand up. Okay. And then one.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't find the electronic hand. Anyway, yes, thanks, Mark. It's very interesting. I've got two questions actually. One is, can the refugees, you presented this vision of them being stuck in hotels with nothing to do. Are they allowed to work on a voluntary basis? And if that's done, can they get with certain organizations, perhaps an in-kind contribution of a sort of a home, a temporary home, anything like that? That's my first question. The second one is a little bit more provocative, sorry, but you talk about very low numbers in the county. But we know that climate change is going to generate a lot more migration across the world. as people, as Emily mentioned, forced migration because conditions become impossible and all sorts of factors playing into that. What do you think the ultimate housing solution would be if we actually had a lot of people coming over the next few years? I mean, have you got any ideas about how to deal with housing as a potential
Yeah,
hotspot, let's say? I mean, Reform talk about it all the time, and I don't like it, but we've got to have a counter narrative on that.
yeah,
Okay, thanks.
sure. The first is people are allowed to volunteer, and many do. Uh, there is a real sensitivity now that I certainly didn't feel a year or so ago, because those people who are being made to leave the hotel at the moment, as I said, for what should be a positive reason, because they're dealing with their applications, many of them have actually only been in the country for a couple of months.
Mm.
Many aren't speaking English, and of course, their ability to learn in the hotel is not non-existent, but it's limited. So some organizations have set up volunteer programs, and they've, in Asylum Welcome, certainly we had many volunteers and were able to help people volunteer in everything ranging from community gardens to the local petting farm through to Oxfam shops. So that is there and is real. People's instability and uncertainty certainly counts against that. And it encourages people much more to try and take the off the cards work of the Deliveroo equivalent, because you can just do it for a few days and that's that. The bigger picture is a much longer reflection than we have time for now. The Of course, Britain has now got to shape its own immigration policy, which is much, much wider than simply that of refugees. And the two things are often joined together. Um, yes, it's desperately important to get a level of control on small boats. It's a horrible way. You wouldn't wish it on anyone. But at the moment, we haven't done anything. We're very good at saying what we're going to stop, and we're not very good at saying what we're going to start. And so until we've got some ability to look much more holistically at what's going on in a given country and how do we respond to it in the way that we did positively with Hong Kong and with Ukraine, I think we'll always have people trying the next way of getting to the UK. So looking at what we could be doing, we can't become the place of arrival of everybody whose homeland and livelihood is being damaged by climate change. But we can come up with some coherent policies and say this is how we're going to play our part in it, both in those countries, in neighbouring countries, and in the UK. I'd love to talk much more about international migration. I think I just probably haven't got time to do that now. Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Sarah.
Good morning, everybody. And Mark, thank you for a very interesting presentation. It was really very informative. I live near the Whitney Hotel and have been involved in community support there. I'm also a parish councillor, so I'm aware of the detail of the application of the owner of the Whitney Hotel, who has applied to return the hotel to its former status as a hotel and increase it by its number of rooms. At our most recent parish council meeting, we were told that if this was to be approved, then the changes would take place in the new year. Now, we have 200 plus people in that hotel. You've just explained that the Home Office may well use Campsfield for single men. So that's one of their options. I'm wondering if you have any information about the families and single women in our hotel, if this planning application was to be positive and the hotel was to close, as we've been told the hotels will close by the government, where those families would go, please.
Okay. The short answer, Sarah, is I don't have any inside information whatsoever, but I can paint the bigger picture. the government has made a commitment to reduce the number of hotels. It is never going to find space for 30,000 people in former army camps. And let me be clear, Campsfield is not an alternative to a hotel, because the people in the hotels are asylum seekers. They have a right to move around. Whereas people in Campsfield are being detained to be deported. So if somebody's application and then appeal is refused, they could then be put in Campsfield. So the government's got to rely on three things. One is reducing the number of people crossing the channel. The second is speeding up the processing, which I'm afraid still puts even more burden on councils, parish councils, district councils, especially with that duty to house, and creates real civic problems, because the people living in the tents around the Qassam are infinitely more of a social worry than the people living in the hotel. And the third is they need to look at longer term proposals for alternative housing. And just as an example, SOHA, the Housing Association of which I'm chair, has put forward a plan that says you could actually look at increasing social housing in a way that eventually benefits the wider community, and in the short term focuses money that's currently being spent on these private contractors on building housing stock. No one of those is the answer. But if the Whitney owners succeed, firstly, they will have a contractual period within which they've got to house people. And secondly, it's infinitely more likely that they will be sent to other hotels than it is that they will be housed in the immediate area. Because while the government wants to reduce its hotel estate, it's not yet succeeding in doing so. And there are more people in Whitney and in Oxford now in hotels than there were a year ago, because they've closed some other hotels. So I think at the moment it's moving the jigsaw.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. We've got time for two more questions. The next one will be from Barry, and then we'll move to Dudu. Thank you.
Okay, mine's not a question. It's just very briefly an expansion on Stephen's point about volunteering. I just wanted to flag up what VLU are doing in the Whitney Hotel with Sally. Works 3 days a week. It's a partnership initiative with the West Oxfordshire District Council. She does a lot of things there, but one of the things she does is place people who want to volunteer. They are allowed to volunteer for charities. We've had 4 people quite regularly working with the town council down at the Ducklington Lake. We've had several volunteers working at the Resource Centre in Moreland Road, gardening. We've placed people at the Cogs Church to again help with the grounds, big clean-up as they call it, the initiatives they have there. And we've got several asylum seekers working at the food bank and placed in charity shops around the town. And I should also say, as again, I won't take up too much of your time, but some of the other initiatives that Sally instigates with other people in the network, I have contributed to actually Ducklington in general receive the residents very well. In general, actually very well. A lot of cooperation. One of the biggest problems we could place a lot more people in voluntary roles is DBSing. Because it's very difficult to get a DBS when you haven't got a history in this country. So that's actually one of our biggest. We are sort of we can nip away and get over it, and sometimes some organisations are all right if people are accompanied or never on their own. But DBS is a difficulty, which is not something we necessarily say, well, we should have DBS, but it's just one of the problems where we would place a lot more. There are a lot of willing people in there. Most people want to do something. They don't want to be bored in their room,
Yeah.
as you pointed out earlier on.
Yeah.
Okay, that's me.
I mean, I certainly appreciate what you've said, and the same is true with local organisations around all three hotels. Where I'd be encouraging us to think more is, what about when people leave the hotel and stay in the area? That's when they become invisible, and that's when each of our organisations can look and say, are there more things we can be doing, and how do we reach those people? So welcoming the kind of work you're doing in Witney and elsewhere. And as I said, it does show really powerful commitment from councils and community organisations and individuals working together.
Just quickly going back to Stephen's point, he did mention in kind, and in kind sort of, but I think there is like a lot of points, there's a lot of limitations on that.
Housing. Anybody who has the ability to be hosting, to be offering housing, and remembering when people have got status, they can pay rent. It hasn't got to be for free. Asylum Welcome can help broker that. So that's the biggest issue. You can provide food for people. The issue is you can't employ them formally. It's not that you can't work with them.
Thank you, Mark. Do you want your question?
Yes, please. Apologies for coming in late. I was having problems with my internet. But I just wanted to say, I worked for many years for an organisation called Refugee Action. We were based in Liverpool, and my role there was a caseworker, was first instance asylum and applications. So I would literally see people as they came off the back of the lorry, and we would do the first instance asylum application and then take them to the Home Office interview. The sad thing I think I found recently in general years, we're almost back to the same situation. And regarding Campsfield as well, I used to visit Campsfield in Oxford. I worked for an organisation called Bail for Immigration Detainees, and we're effectively back in the same situation. And as community groups, there are ways where we can gather together in terms of volunteers. For example, I volunteer for a charity based in Farringdon, and next to that, there is council housing for people who are awaiting reviews of their asylum application. And I think it's about volunteer groups combining together. One of the key factors I've found is I can get volunteer work for people, but they don't have enough money, for example, to travel into Oxford. It's £6 something from Farringdon on a day pass. So I think it's very little steps as voluntary organisations that we can make in order to make sure the people who want to travel, who want to, I don't know, go and visit green spaces, or get on the internet and have a look at jobs that are available, can do that once they've received their indefinite leave to remain. And then additionally, indefinite leave to remain was usually after 5 years you can make an application for it, but currently now the British government are trying to increase that. I think it's to 10 years they're trying to increase it. So there are so many levels where people, if they haven't a successful asylum claim and get indefinite leave to remain, there's still so many barriers in front of them, and especially when they get that indefinite leave to remain. Sorry, it's something I'm very passionate about, and there are just so many levels of support that can be given to people, but obviously with a right-wing swing at the moment, we're going to face barriers in trying to help people.
Yeah. Well, I think you've illustrated lots of the ways in which we can. The extra thing that's happened in the last few months that's added to what you've just described has been that when people got the right to remain, in other words, their asylum application was approved, they used to be allowed to bring over their family, immediate family. That's now been made much, much harder, and most people can't do it immediately. So it means that when they leave, it should be a moment of real, I'm safe now, I'm here now, I can build my life. And that's being undermined by both the housing dimension and by things like reducing the ability to bring your immediate family, which then means you leave lots of single men in the UK with families elsewhere, which again is not going to be good for anybody.
Yeah, the family reunion. I remember working at Refugee Action, trying to basically signpost people to different law firms that could start the family reunion process. And you're absolutely right. That is something they're just trying to remove from the Human Rights Act at the moment.
Yep.
Well, thank you very, very much to our speaker, Mark Goldring. Thank you very, very much for really pertinent and important questions. And I think actually just coming together and working together and doing what we have with the assets and the resources that we've got is really important. And there's so much more we could be doing. So thank you very much. We will definitely be sharing this recording as far and wide, and we'll try and pull out some key points as well.